welcome again, everybody, from wherever you are to this live web event on the healing power of stillness. I'm Laurie Snorek, and I am a Christian Science practitioner, teacher, and lecturer. I'm based in the Boston area, and some of you are joining us from all over the place. And this talk is sponsored today by the Christian Science Church in Medford, Oregon. So welcome to all of those of you who are joining us today from Medford. I hear there's a lot of snow there, and some of you got snowed in, so it's a good thing you can jump on your computer. And I think some of you have gathered together as well to watch this. So welcome to everyone. Just a couple of logistical items as we get started. Hopefully, I guess if you're listening, then you've all gotten on accurately and figured all of it out. You at the moment are seeing me full screen. As the web event goes on, there will be slides that come and go, and I'll toggle between the slides and me, but there'll also be a little box in the corner, one of the corners of your screen, and you'll see the speaker in the corner when the slides are on. And you should be able to toggle between whichever view you want if you're in front of your computer. If you'd rather see the speaker or the slide, you can kind of control that if you have a preference. And other than that, there will be a couple points in this web event where you can chat and participate. So that will be for those of you that are in front of the computer. If you're watching collectively in a room, whoever's controlling the computer can chat in your responses. So I will allow a little pause time to allow you to chat, but please be ready to participate. And then there's also a question and answer box, which says Q&A on it. And you can type in a question anytime during the web event, and I will answer questions at the end. So you're welcome to chat in any questions. And I'll also leave some time at the end for questions. Okay, so I think those are all of the logistical items, and we will get started with the healing power of stillness. I'm going to start off today just by sharing with you something that I was told as a graduate student. I have a graduate degree in sustainable development and also in peace building. And when I was going to a talk, when I was a peace building student, my professor encouraged me as I was going this weekend to hear the speaker. He said that most people pay attention to what the speaker says and they take notes on that. And he said, but Laurie, I want you to pay attention to what your own heart is saying while you're listening. And that's what I want you to take notes on. And that's my advice to you today as well, that as you hear me share from my heart, my stories, my experiences, I hope that you hear your own heart speaking somehow. And that's the real message that you came for today. So pay attention to that message more than anything else. All right, so to get started, I'll just also share with you a story that I heard years ago when I think also as a graduate student. And it's a story that, one second, let me just get up the slide here. Just giving us a little trouble at the moment. There we go. It's a story of a cellist, and we're going to go back in time a little bit to 1992 in the city of Sarajevo. And on this particular day, the cellist, as you can see in this photo, he comes into the center square of Sarajevo, and he plunks down a plastic chair and a cello case. He's dressed all in formal attire as if he's giving a concert, and he sits down and he starts to play. And as the mellow sounds of the cello fill the square behind him, in the background, there are artillery shells falling on buildings, and people are running for cover because it's the start of the Bosnian Civil War. Now, this man, Vedran Smilovic, was the principal cellist of the Sarajevo Opera Orchestra. And he didn't just come this one time to the center square to play his cello, but he came back for 22 consecutive days to play a piece of music, to commemorate 22 men, women, and children that were killed in a bread line at the start of the war. This was his response to the violence that he saw around him in his city. He didn't know how to broker a ceasefire between the warring factions of his area, of his nation, but he had his music, and he offered what little he could give to commemorate those that had been suffering in the war. Now, why are we talking about this today in terms of stillness? Well, what it says to me about stillness, first of all, and primary, I think, is that we're not looking for a stillness where nothing happens in our life, where everything is in perfect order and we don't have any challenges, although maybe that's a goal for some of you. But I think the real goal is that we bring our stillness to whatever chaos, whatever difficulty, whatever challenges we have to face on any given day. And that we find that stillness within ourselves, within our own consciousness. And then we bring it in a way that it doesn't get shaken or disturbed, no matter what is thrown at us outside of us. So whatever might be bombarding your thought on a daily basis, hopefully you'll never be in a war zone like this man was, but whatever it is that bombards our thinking on any given day, can we maintain in ourselves that same deep, settled calm that this man, I imagine, must have experienced, and bring it into the midst of what seems like the most challenging day with demands on our time, or a chaotic situation, or a difficult conversation, perhaps? Can we bring that stillness to it in a way that transforms our experience of it? Now, someone shared with me this quote years ago that I really love, and I think it talks about this sense of stillness. It says, "At the center of the most turbulent heart, there is a place of peace, a place beyond time that cannot be touched by change or loss. No tumult can disturb the quietness, no shadow can dim the light. Here, in this stillness, is rest and healing. Nothing we suffer, nothing that we fear can damage its perfection." Now, I hope you can hear in this passage the idea that this stillness is already inside of us. It's not something that we have to change our external environment to find. It's not based on circumstances. It's not based on a change in our circumstances, or in a change or in a certain outcome or a certain result in our lives. It's not necessarily based on having a quiet home situation or a peaceful work environment, although those are great goals to work on. But it's really about a state of thought, about finding that stillness of mind that we bring to whatever situation in which we find ourselves, and in a way that we can maintain it so that it doesn't get disturbed, so that no tumult, no disturbance can dim it, can take away that peace and stillness that we found within us. And that's in that place is where we find that sense of healing power. We're going to talk today about the way that when we connect with that sense of stillness, that we find healing and we find that sense of rest that we're talking about here. Now, an analogy that helps me with this is, again, back to sort of musical analogies today. You'll see on your screen right now a cello, a picture of a cello. And you may notice in the bottom part of the screen, there's some little knobs, black knobs on the cello, and those are the fine tuning knobs. And the first thing that a cellist does when he or she gets into their private lesson, or when they're getting ready for an orchestra performance or a chamber music performance, or really before they play or perform anywhere, is that they tune. They have to tune their instrument. And an instrumentalist, a cellist, doesn't just tune once and then the instrument stays tuned for the whole day. You have to retune throughout the day as you play it. The more you play the instrument, the more you have to tune it. Well, one day I was in a lesson of one of my children, and they were tuning their instrument, and the teacher had put on a pure, perfect tone from the tuner. And then my child started to play the instrument, the cello, play the cello. I guess I'm doing a violin here, but anyway, play the cello. And then he turned the fine tuning knobs of the cello until the cello came and lined itself up perfectly with that pure tone from the tuner. And in that moment, Even though my son was playing the cello and there was the tuner going, when I closed my eyes, I couldn't hear two different things happening. I couldn't distinguish between the pure, perfect tone and the instrument. And that to me is what stillness, how I experience it. That in those moments of getting deeply quiet inside and finding the stillness of mind, that where all the racing thoughts and responsibilities and worries and concerns and fears and doubts and challenges and regrets and longings and desires, all of those things are quieted. And in that moment, it feels like oneness, like being perfectly tuned in to God. Now, what do we mean by God? Well, everything you'll hear today in this talk comes from my practice of Christian Science. Now, briefly, those two words, Christian and science, come from a book written by Mary Baker Eddy, which I'll introduce you to shortly, and a religion called Christian Science, a practice of really spirituality. And it was named Christian Science. First of all, the Christian aspect relates to the Bible. It's based on the Bible and following Jesus' teachings. But the science part is really about where we get the authority to practice Christianity. That rather than the authority coming from listening to a pastor or a preacher or some hierarchy in the church and taking their word for it, or just taking it on faith and trying to sort of see how our faith can maybe work in some situations, but maybe not in others if we don't have enough faith, etc. That Christian Science says we find the authority for Christianity in practice in our life. That in a science, you don't just take a science on faith. You don't just take the fact that physics works on faith. You have to test it out in the labs that you do in the physics class or in chemistry or in biology. Well, the lab for Christian Science is really life. And we take the ideas, the vision given by the Bible on Christianity and put it into practice, test it out in life, and find the authority to live Christianity in our life, in how it transforms our life experience. That's what healing really is. It's aligning ourselves with God and seeing the effect in our lives. Now, again, what do we mean by God? Well, this sense of alignment we just talked about, that oneness that I mentioned, what that's like for me is, I guess a very simple analogy is sort of turning my face towards the sun and feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. And that if we're hiding in the shadows, that it's cooler there and we don't necessarily see the sun. But God's light, the sense of God is like the sunlight, which is always shining from this one source, this divinity, which is everywhere. The presence of God fills every space. It fills the universe. And that as we turn our thoughts towards this idea of infinite love, of there sort of being this higher truth, there being a mind that is the consciousness of the universe, that is bigger than one person or bigger than a religion even. But as we turn to these infinite ideas, these ideas that don't have a starting point or an ending point, they don't start with one religion and then end with that particular religion, but there's sort of these universal laws of divine love and how they're in practice. And as we turn to sort of look and become curious about those laws, it's like we're turning our face to the sun and the light shines on us and we feel that presence and it changes how we feel and how we experience life. And that to me is what God is like. It's like that shining of the sun. And we find it by turning within to our own heart, our own thoughts, our own consciousness to find that presence of God. And that to me is what it feels like to align ourselves perfectly, that stillness brings us into line with this divine presence that warms us, that comforts us in times of need, that gives us a sense of all being well, even if there might be all this chaos around us or uncertainty or unsolved issues or unfulfilled desires, that in that moment where we get still, that we're tuning ourselves in. Forgot to mute my phone. There we go. We tune ourselves in to that divine voice of God, that divine presence. And it feels like oneness. And in that moment is where our sort of cares and worries fall away. And then the goal then is to bring that out when we, into the world, into our daily lives. So we'll talk more about that. As I mentioned, Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science, who wrote the book Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, a companion book to the Bible, which you'll see in a moment. She also said this, she said, keep your violin in tune. She was talking about how she healed. Some of her students had asked her about healing, and she said that if your violin is in tune, there's no need to tune it up, and that you should keep it in tune all the time. Now, she's not talking about a real instrument, obviously, but she's speaking about how our lives are about constantly fine-tuning ourselves to God. And that as we do that throughout our day, rather than just when we have a big challenge, but as we throughout our day are sort of tuning ourselves into God, that we experience life and we experience that stillness. So keeping ourselves tuned into what God is saying, that's how stillness is experienced for me. All right, so this is our key idea from the Bible. Be still and know that I am God. Now, how many things do you hear in this passage? 2 things, right? Be still, and then know that I am God. And to me, this really sums up stillness as I understand it from my practice of Christian Science. That we want to get still by quieting the racing thoughts, sort of putting aside worldly cares and worldly preoccupations and all of the rush of daily life, the hurriedness, etc., the pressure, the stress, all those things that are on our shoulders so often. And as we want to get still, and in that moment of quieting the world, sort of shutting it out a bit and just getting still in our consciousness, the next thing is to really fill up with that sense of God, of presence, to really notice it, to feel it, to tune in to that divine presence, which is always there. So that's the key second step. Now, Mary Baker Eddy, in her book, she talks about how to take the Bible and sort of put it into practice. And this is what she says about this sense of stillness. She says that we hear God or spirit when our senses are silent. And so I think this is just really key, that throughout the day, are we making time to silence our senses? Or are we just relying on them constantly for what we see, what we hear, maybe what we're tasting, that all of these physical senses are just directing our daily life and sometimes running us ragged and pulling us in a direction where there's always more to do, or maybe we don't have enough to do and we're wishing we did. But that either way, we're getting our information about our lives from the pull of what we see and hear and do. And I think what we're talking about here is that stillness is when we quiet all the doing and all the stuff we see with our eyes or hear with our ears, that we're just going into that mental space where we're hearing and seeing and perceiving spiritually, which means perceiving the divine presence, that sense of divine oneness with God. And in that moment, when the senses are quiet, we hear what God has to say to us. We hear divine messages coming to us that direct our lives, that redirect our lives sometimes, and bring us that sense of peace. All right, so we're going to talk about 3 different ways to apply this. We're going to look at briefly being still in ourselves and how that can bring healing to our own self. We're going to talk about being still in relationship with others and how that can help us in relationship to others. And then finally, in terms of world events, when we get pulled down the road of concern about the world, how can we be still in the face of what's going on in the world? All right, so I mentioned that our talk was based on two different books, the Bible and the book, the Science and Health book, which is the definitive textbook written about Christian Science. It's available to anyone. It is not meant to be a it is what Christian Science, the Christian Science Church is based on, but it's a book that is available for anyone to purchase and read regardless of religion, and can be accessible to anyone. Mary Baker Eddy, as the founder of Christian Science, was somebody that really understood and knew stillness. She made it a priority when she was writing her book to really find that stillness. Now, she moved back to New Hampshire at one point from Boston, where she lived in the busy city of Boston back in the late 1800s in 1892. And she did say it was to find stillness. Now, of course, it was calmer in New Hampshire. And definitely sometimes those of us that live in big cities or suburban areas can find just a little more quiet when we go to the mountains maybe, or on vacation, or go to the lake, or wherever it is for you that you go that might be a still place. But what we're looking for in stillness is not to depend on or to only change our external environment, but to really recognize that same stillness we see outside of ourselves and find it within ourselves. And what she was doing was really sort of taking herself out a little bit of this worldly, the public gatherings and kind of this worldly sense, to really be in the closet. Now, what's she talking about with the closet? Well, it's where Jesus said that you go into the closet to pray and you shut the door. And that's that sense of stillness. She saw herself as this honest investigator of truth. She was really interested in truth and finding it and seeing the way that it wasn't just an intellectual exercise, but it was about living that out in life and seeing the impact of it, the way that Christ Jesus taught and the way that people experienced healing from Jesus. All right, so part one, looking at healing for ourselves. So as you'll see on your screen, there's a top, and I like this sense of the spinning top, that when it's perfectly spinning, it may be moving very quickly, but if you step back a little bit, it can look like it's still. I think that's the goal. We're not talking about a stagnancy or an emptiness or a stopping of all activity. What we're talking about here is the sense of movement, but from a place within that's calm and quiet and still. Now, I don't think this is sort of a one-time achievement thing. For me, it's a practice. And it gets easier with practice. And a lot of it is just remembering to practice it, to take a couple of minutes, maybe before I drive my daughter to school, or just to take a couple of minutes before I answer a phone call, or before I make a meal, or whatever it is that I might be doing, to take that moment and to just connect with that sense of stillness, to be still, to quiet thought, maybe take a deep breath, whatever works for me in the moment, just put down whatever I'm doing, just briefly, and then go into the activity. And it just has this effect of relaxing my whole being, and I can do the activity in a different way. Maybe I'm laughing more, I'm noticing what's happening, but I'm not just rushing from one thing to the next. And I find it's a little practice, moment by moment throughout the day. And that it gets easier as you do it. So the spinning top for me is the idea that we can be moving, but we want to be moving. It's how we're moving that we want to think about with stillness, and how we bring our stillness to whatever we're doing. I'm a really avid runner, although at the moment it's winter in most of America, where I have been lately, and so my running routine has been slightly hampered. But at any rate, I often am a daily runner, and maybe a month or two ago, I had gone out for a run before giving one of these talks, and it occurred to me to think about how I could go for my run with stillness. And what I loved about this question that came to me was that, again, it's not about sitting still and not moving, but it was a quality of thought that I wanted to bring to the activity. And it sort of preoccupied me for most of the run to think about that. How can we run with stillness? But it was a way of relaxing thought and calming thought and bringing that to whatever we were doing. And it felt like a more effortless run than I'd had in a while. So again, just asking ourselves that question sometimes, remembering to connect with that stillness can be enough. All right, so we're going to, for a moment, I'm just going to turn off the slides here because I want to open the chat box and I want you all to have an opportunity to participate here. So I hope that you have found on your screen the little chat box. It's called webinar chat, I think. And so as you chat into it, I'll see what you're chatting and I'll just share it with everybody. And here's what we're going to talk about. So as we're thinking about stillness with ourselves, I think really key in this is to connect first with this vision of what it looks like to be at peace with ourselves. So that's the question I have for all of you that are listening. So if you can chat in any of your answers, and I'll try to give you a little time here, but what does it look like for you to be at peace with yourself? How do you know when you're truly at peace with yourself? For me, that it's that sense of alignment we talked about, but that it can take some effort sometimes, that it can take a sense of focus or a sense of, again, practicing that stillness. So go ahead and find your chat box. Hopefully there's some of you that can access it. And if you can just chat in how you know when you feel at peace with yourself, what does it look like? And that's what we're going to just talk about for a few minutes here. So I think it should be open. Hopefully you all are finding it. Okay, so I will let you type in your chat box. And in the meantime, I'll just share a couple of ideas that have worked for me, ways that I know when I'm truly feeling at peace with myself. One way is that I stop judging. I'm no longer interested in judging others or criticizing others, that I'm willing to let it go. That even if I notice something someone's doing, I'm willing to just let it roll off. I don't feel the need to criticize or judge. That's when I know I'm fairly at peace with myself. That's one characteristic. Somebody mentioned on the chat that they feel like it's a release, that being at peace with ourselves is releasing. What I love about that is it is a sense of letting go of control, that rather than feeling like we have to be in charge all the time of everything, we let go of that sense of control and release it. And actually, just as a side note, that passage we talked about, be still and know that I am God, I believe it's in the Hebrew, that sense of stillness, being still, means to release, to let go of. And in the sort of the Hebrew origin of the word, the phrase. And so there is that sense of really that stillness is about releasing and letting go. So that's great. Let's see, a couple of people said, someone said, I'm being complete, that you know you're at peace with yourself when you feel whole and complete. And that is a wonderful thing to connect with, that even if we feel a void sometimes through, maybe taking a child to college and realizing they're sort of on their own and that journey of parenting is ending, or, a relationship that might be ending or changing, taking a different form, or switching jobs or moving to a new place, that there's somehow is this loss or this change, that to really be at peace with ourselves is to feel the completeness before we even see the way it resolves itself, to really know that even though it feels like a void, to know that it's already complete, and to be eager to see how life unfolds, even if we don't know what the outcome is, but to cultivate that eagerness of expectation that is eager to see how things happen. That's when we know we're at peace. Okay, good. Someone said, realize I don't have to do everything, but let everything happen, right? That letting go, not being in control. Someone else said, focusing on the task at hand without being distracted by other things. So this is great. This is great that we're really able to focus. That's when we're at peace with ourselves. We don't get pulled by our Facebook feed or our phone buzzing on social media, or, oh, that person we just wanted to talk to, or whatever, that we really are able to spend some time, whatever time is sort of the right optimal time, focusing in the present moment. And that is so key to me, that when we're at peace with ourselves, we do feel focused on the present moment, and we're not so worried about what happened in the past or concerned about the future, but we're really settled on the present moment. Someone said weightlessness. That's interesting. I would love to hear more about that one, but I think for me, what weightlessness feels like is not having burdens on us, that we're unburdened. When we're at peace with ourselves, we don't take on false responsibility. We don't feel responsible for other people, for their feelings, their concerns. We want to live the best life we can live, and we're not taking a sort of overly responsible sense about what happens with other people. So we're not worried about approval from others or trying to work up to their approval or whatever. We're really focused on just being ourselves and feeling unburdened by our lives. So that's how I interpret that weightlessness one. Someone mentioned having more patience with yourself and others. That's a great quality. Someone else shared this idea of sort of being in tune with a partner, like when you're dancing and there's a dancing with a partner and there's kind of that synergy there. That's a beautiful analogy of being at peace with yourself, just working with others in harmony and feeling the way that when we interact with the world, it's on that basis of harmony. All right, I'm just going to highlight a couple more. You can keep chatting and it'll show up, I think, for everybody, but I'll just highlight a couple more here. Knowing that God is in control, and just free to be. Someone said just free to be. That's a great phrase, free to just be who we are and not feel like we're falling short or we have to be more. I think, again, it's that sense of being approved of, it's a sense of confidence, but not in ego, more in just being who we were created to be and being able to live that. That's beautiful. And just that sense of being totally comfortable. So I love that sense of comfort that surrounds us. I'm just going to add a couple more that for me, being at peace with myself is, and we kind of mentioned this, but a willingness to let things unfold rather than having to make them happen all the time. And I think for me, that's really key. It was key in a healing experience I had a few years ago. I was in a place where throughout the previous number of years, I had been having these reoccurring pain in my neck and shoulders. I would get this really stiff neck. I wouldn't be able to move it. It would be uncomfortable. I kept thinking it was from how I slept or something else that happened. And then throughout the day, it would kind of get worse and kind of come and go. And I had grown up in a family where we learned to pray for healing. So finding that stillness in prayer and expecting that to heal what was going on in our bodies, that by having that conversation with God, it would shift how we thought about ourselves and change our bodies. And so I was taught that at a young age. And that was how I generally practiced dealing with any problems that came up in my life. So in this situation, when I was having this reoccurring challenge, I often went to prayer with it and God, but I hadn't been finding permanent relief. And this particular time, it was right before Christmas, and I had just had a lot on my shoulders, literally and figuratively. I'd taken on a lot of responsibility. And I woke up one morning with this crick in my neck again. And I have to admit, my first thought was kind of along the lines of, oh no, God, I do not have the time for this. I really have a lot going on. I need a healing really quick so I can get on with all the things I have to do. Now, who do you hear at the center of that prayer? Right? Kind of myself, right? So it's almost like I was sort of like, I am the CEO of my life and God is this thing that intervenes and kind of helps me out with problems. That's not the God we talked about earlier, right? Which is that divine presence that pervades everything. This was more of like this God that kind of intervenes for some people, but not others. And that's not a God that Christian Science believes in. But on this particular day, I just really wanted to find an idea that would heal me so I could get on to do all the things I had going on. Well, needless to say, I went through the day. I had this pain. It got worse and worse. It didn't help. Same for the next day. And by the third day, I was in the most pain I'd ever experienced. And so I was having to be still in my bed, physically not move. And I started examining my prayers a little more. And as I started to pray, I began to sort of shut that door we talked about and quiet all the racing thoughts that were coming to me. And as my thought got still, what I heard in the stillness was this idea. And the idea said, I am the shepherd. Now, I hadn't really been thinking about shepherds or sheep or whatever, but I've grown up studying the 23rd Psalm, which talks about God being our shepherd. So this presence of love shepherding us throughout life. And I realized in that moment that what I was missing about that analogy was that I really didn't like the idea of being a sheep. In fact, I was kind of biased against the idea of being a sheep. And the reason was because, and I'm sure I was told this by a teacher when I was younger, that you should never be a sheep because sheep, well, why? Because they're blind followers, right? So sheep are kind of, they blindly follow. And I'm sure my teacher back in elementary school meant don't blindly follow your friends. Think for yourself. Don't be a follower. But in the process of cultivating that leadership in myself and that confidence and that directiveness, I had this bias against following. And what I realized in this moment, in bed, in pain, not being able to move without excruciating pain all the way up my spine, was that I needed to appreciate the qualities of the sheep. Okay, get ready because you get to chat again if you're still by your computer. What do you think are these good qualities of the sheep? What are they for you? So go ahead and chat those in the chat box again. I'll give you a few minutes to do that. I could see how shepherding, whether it's shepherding projects or kids or our homes or our lives, was more effective when we knew how we were a sheep with divine love or divine presence shepherding us. That there was this power, this spiritual divine energy and power that shepherds us, that moves us, that is the force behind what we do. And when we are connected to that, when we're tuned in to God in that way, then we go forward with those sheep qualities with that divine presence. So here are some of the sheep qualities: humility, responsiveness, that's great, yielding. The sheep are willing to yield. If the shepherd changes direction, they just go. The sheep don't say, oh, wait, no, I really wanted to go that direction, right? Or if they do, they're gently nudged, right, to go in the right direction. Willingness to follow, obedience, trusting, meekness, receptivity, purity. Someone said recognizing the shepherd's voice. Yep, listening. Thank you, that's great. Excellent qualities of the sheep. Listening to the shepherd's voice. The sheep actually can tune in to their shepherd's voice. They know that voice they can distinguish it from other voices. And that was key for me. That to me, being a sheep on that day meant hearing the voice of divine love of God more louder than I heard my own voice speaking. Sort of hearing that divine presence and that guidance from God more loudly than I hear my own demands, my own wishes, my own desires for what should happen. And what happened is as I was feeling those sheep qualities, it just made me relax. I could feel my whole body just relaxing, and all the pain sort of dissipated with it over a series of a few hours as I was in bed that day. But just letting go of responsibility, of feeling like it was all up to me, of feeling alone and doing a lot of things that I had to do, and just feeling shepherded. And I think that's what allows us to be better shepherds for projects, for companies, for children, for maybe our parents, for church work, for whatever it is we have to do. As we know how we're shepherded, we are better shepherds for those things in our lives. And that insight as I was pondering that and reflecting on all those qualities, someone mentioned gentleness, acceptance. As I was thinking about all of those, and again, slowly that pain left. And not only did it leave for that day, but the problem went away for good. Because what changed and what shifted for me in that moment was that relationship that I had to God. And this may seem like, a really simple idea. I learned it probably when I was in Sunday school, that God shepherds us and we should follow the shepherd. But in this context as an adult, what I was needing here was to shift the center of my day and keep it centered and focused on what God was doing and how I was being. So that each of us, we can see ourselves as the outcome of what God is doing. That our job is to focus on being more than on doing a lot of things. And that when we focus on our being, we accomplish more, we're better rested, we don't tire as easily, we have ideas come to us that maybe we didn't think of before, maybe more creative ideas that solve problems quicker, that things flow in a way that feels like less effort is going into them. And just one last point about this, that sometimes in practicing healing and trying to get still to find that healing, we can feel, again, like we're being in charge of the healing. That we have this problem and we want to apply spiritual ideas to it to get to a solution. But what I learned through this experience was that even in wanting to find a healing or resolve a challenge, that it's those sheep qualities of yielding our own thoughts to what's happening with divine presence. It's the tuning in that helps us to see the ways that we're already at peace. So having that vision of what it looks like to be at peace that we talked about, that's the starting point. Even if we don't feel confident, even if we don't feel a lack of pain, the pain seems to still be there. Even if we don't feel a sense of harmony yet, that to start with that vision and ponder that vision sometimes resolves the problem without even focusing on the problem. Because it's not a problem-solving method to get to healing. It's an aligning and a tuning in to a new reality of our relationship to the divine that then changes our experience. Okay, so that was a long section on stillness with ourselves, really finding that quiet, whether we're forced to, as in my case, or whether we practice it moment by moment and really get still to tune into God, that's kind of key for sort of everything that comes after. Now, we spent a good amount of time on that, so I'm just going to move on here. I'm just going to share one idea with you, and you'll see it on your screen now, and then we'll move on to part 2. Mary Baker Eddy wrote this. She said, "To the burdened and weary, Jesus saith, Come unto me. There remaineth a rest for the righteous, a rest in Christ, a peace in love. The thought of it stills complaint. The heaving surf of life's troubled sea foams itself away, and underneath is a deep, settled calm." And I hope you can see in this or hear in this that the calm, the peace is already there. That as the turbulence foams itself away and we go into that place of being still, we find the calm, we find the healing, we find that peace there. That we're discovering it, we're not creating it. All right, so the second part here, the power of stillness for relationships with others. All right, so to me, this, the part of this that I think is really key is, let's see if we can go to the next section here, is this idea that comes from Paul. So after Jesus did all of his teaching, Paul sort of took on Jesus' teaching and spread it throughout the whole region at that point. He talked to the Thessalonians, the Corinthians, etc., and he traveled throughout the area. And he would say in many different ways, you have the mind of Christ. Now, what did he mean? What is this Christ that he meant? Well, here's another opportunity if you're into participating again. What does it mean to you to have the mind of Christ? So go ahead and chat that in. What does that mean? When we talk about Christ, we're not talking about Jesus. in this quote that you have on your screen, Paul's talking to the Philippians. He says, let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus. So this idea of the mind of Christ, it's this, that there's the same mind, which is this consciousness that's bigger than one person. Again, go ahead and chat in what it means to you, the mind of Christ, if you're in front of your computer. So it's bigger than one person. It's a spirit that enabled Jesus to do what he did, but that is timeless. It's beyond a person or a time period. It existed prior to Jesus, and it's present with us today. This Christ is a spirit of divine goodness that speaks to us, that comes to us from God. It's sort of the message from God to men. So it's the connection. And we hear it as inspiration in our thoughts. So some of you have mentioned, great, this is good, that the mind of Christ is to have the same mental perspective as Jesus. Good, right? It's a mental perspective. Great. It gives you spiritual authority for healing. Absolutely. The Christ idea is where we get authority from. It's not from ego. It's not from someone else. It's from that deep sense of Christ inside. To be spiritually minded, to really, oh, this is nice, to give up preconceptions and to be open to thought that maybe we weren't thinking previously. That's great. So giving up our kind of preconceived notions to really be open to sort of divine inspiration. It's God's ideas coming to us clearly. And the mind of Christ, this is interesting too, that the mind of Christ enables us to know the needs of others without them having to verbalize it. That's a great one. You know, it enables us to see in a way that we weren't seeing before. It's not seen with the eyes, it's really seen to the heart and discerning the heart, even if the person might be saying one thing, but we can see in their heart that they're saying something different, and that we can discern that and respond to that. And it's a calm, powerful thought that quiets our sort of squirrely mind. Yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing on that one. So the mind of Christ, it enables us to not react to circumstance. It gives us our thoughts directly from God, and it shifts our perspective. So I'm just going to share another story with you about this. And I have two younger sisters, and one of them has not had any children. She gave birth to a wonderful PhD. So that was sort of her baby for many years, so far in her life at least. But years ago, when I became a new mom, my younger sister would come over and she loved to give me parenting advice. Now, I said she had no kids, right? So this would kind of grate a little bit on me, you know, and I would get a little defensive about my newfound parenting style and technique and everything I was learning. And she would often, you know, decide she wanted to give, you know, help me out here and give me some advice. Well, this created a little conflict with us. Excuse me. And it became kind of a pattern. And it was happening that over time, as she would come over, I would sort of start to expect this conflict. And if you've ever had this with someone, you can sort of feel yourself tensing up a little bit, kind of getting ready to fight when you're to defend yourself, when you're being criticized, to defend whatever it is that you're expecting this person's going to criticize you on. And so that's what had been happening to me. Well, one day I realized this needed to stop. And this was the idea. What does it mean to have the mind of Christ? Was what I started thinking about. And not only that I have it, but that she has it. That it's a collective mind. It's sort of this infinite mind that everybody is tuned into, can tune into. It doesn't matter your experience, your religion, your whatever, where you live, you really can tune into this oneness of mind. And so that would enable us to have this relationship of harmony. Well, I didn't know how exactly it would happen, but I figured that it would mean pausing my own thought process to really allow that Christ mind, that divine goodness, that inspiration to come in and interrupt the flow of the repetitive nature of our stuck conflict. So I didn't exactly know how it worked, but I was intrigued by this. And so the next time she came over and I could feel myself getting ready to tense up and react, I just paused after she said something. kind of relaxed. And right in that little pause came this idea. Now, I don't know what the idea was. I'm sorry, I can't remember it, but it was something that I blurted out, just some little comment. And we just erupted into laughter. And the reason that I know that that came from a divine source, something beyond my little mind, some other consciousness called the Christ idea, was because my sister and I, at this point in our lives, really did not have a sense of humor. And so this was a key element for me on how this was really the Christ that was connecting us. The Christ in me was connecting to the Christ in her. And it made us good humored and relaxed and not reactive to each other. Now, this is a really small instance, but I think that whether it's someone on the other political spectrum from you, whether it's somebody that maybe you've been estranged from for years, that just this awareness that the divine goodness in each of us connects to the divine goodness in another person, that everyone has it. And even if you're about to say, but they don't express it, or but they think this, or but, it doesn't matter. That at the heart of each of us, we connect at that level of the Christ speaking to the Christ, the divine idea of goodness speaking to that divine idea of goodness. And it changes the conversation. And when we get more curious about how the Christ is interacting, we feel less defensive. We feel less entrenched in our position. We feel less like we have to be right or be understood or be heard or be respected. Not that those are bad things, but they can get in the way of respecting others, of listening well to others, of approving of others. Whenever I find myself listening to somebody but thinking of what I'm going to say next, I realize I'm not thinking with that Christ mind. I'm thinking with sort of my ego mind. And the goal is to put that ego off, to be receptive, to allow that Christ idea to come forward, because the interactions are always better in my experience. So that was a brief touch on the second part here of being still in relationships with others. And I think that the key here for me, again, is just letting that mind of Christ be there. We don't have to make it happen. Sometimes we just have to pause, maybe slow down, or just pause a little bit. We don't have to slow down everything, but finding that moment of pause, of stillness, to allow that Christ to come through and to let it be the impulse for the interaction. And it changes our ability. It changes the way we respond. It may not change the other person. In fact, my sister never stopped giving me parenting advice. She gave me some the other day, actually. And what happened, though, was that I stopped reacting to it. I didn't feel the need to defend myself anymore. And I could listen and take what was useful and let go what wasn't. It was a whole different way of responding. And that's what the Christ does for us. All right, so now let's just go here to part 3, where we're talking about stillness for the world. We'll kind of close with this. And if you have questions and answers, go ahead and start typing them in if you'd like to type a question. If you'd like to add in a comment that you didn't get in earlier, please use the Q&A box, though I'm not going to look back at the chat box right now. So go ahead and type your comments or your contributions or your questions into the Q&A box that you find on the screen at any time, and then we'll get to that in just a moment. So finally, to close here, we'll talk about maintaining stillness in face of world events. And one story that has helped me a lot was a contest for children that happened years ago when I was, again, studying peace building. And they had asked children to draw what they thought peace looked like. And the winning entry was an image of this roaring, rushing waterfall. And the child had drawn it. It was very turbulent down below. And behind the waterfall, on a little ledge, the child had drawn a canary, a little yellow canary bird. And this little yellow canary bird was pictured as singing. Now, we don't have a lot of time here to do some more chatting, but think for yourself about what that image represents for you and why they chose it to be peace. Because it's not a serene, beautiful scene with nothing happening, right? The turbulence of the waterfall is there. It's very loud. These waterfalls are quite loud. But yet the canary's there. And the canary's not off, far away with its back to the waterfall. It's right behind the waterfall. And yet it's singing. So there's so many things that this teaches me. And I'm sure if you all were contributing, you'd have your own insights. I'd love to hear them. But one thing it says is just this nature of being undisturbed. That no matter how loud the noise gets, no matter how crazy it is, no matter how incredulous you feel by saying, look what he or she is saying, I can't believe it. Can you believe she did this again? Can you believe this is happening? Can you believe this happened in the past or in the history and they're going to be governor and now this happened, et cetera, et cetera. The drama, the amount of opportunities on any given day to get sucked under by the pull of that waterfall underwater, to be sucked into sort of this current of thought that is incredulous, that stands just stunned at some of the antics, that just cannot really believe maybe what is going on in the world. That as much as we may fall into those traps sometimes or get pulled with the force of that waterfall, to me, the goal is being like the canary. It's finding that little ledge, that little place where we're sturdy, right? It's a rock ledge. So we're on solid ground. We're not being blown around. We're not in the pool, kind of struggling with the water falling over us. We're on the solid ground on that rock ledge. And our voice is not drowned out. Now, maybe the canary's voice was drowned out by the waterfall, but the canary didn't care. The canary was singing, regardless of whether the canary could be heard or not. And I think that to me is so key. There's a story that I heard years ago by a woman who had lived in Eastern Germany during the time of the Berlin Wall. And I was 20 years old at the time. And she was giving a talk about how she had prayed every single day for 10 years straight, which was at this point in my life, half my lifetime. Every day she prayed for the wall to come down. And I went up to her afterwards and I said, how did you keep going? How did you not get discouraged after 10 years every day of praying? And she said, I'll never forget it. She said, Laurie, the wall came down in a moment, but it wasn't the work of a moment. Maybe some of you have heard similar stories. That it was the work of all of those moments leading up that changed consciousness, that changed thought. And then she said, how do you think you changed thought? She said every prayer she could feel was chipping away at the mental blocks that were holding the wall together. And that because she knew that by offering her sense of stillness and peace and hopefulness out into the world, into the mental environment that we talked about earlier tonight, that was changing the mental environment of thought, which would result in the change physically. And if you think about any innovation, any creative idea, the Tesla, the iPhone, the fact that we can do this whole webinar thing here, I can sit in one part of the world and you can hear me in another part. All of these innovations started with a thought. And that as we maintain ourselves on that rock ledge, that sturdy foundation of hopefulness, of love and compassion and care, good humor is certainly in there, but good humor that doesn't berate others, that doesn't want to find fault, but maybe just finds the humor. That as we focus on those qualities and we really hold to them and don't let ourselves get disturbed inside, that we find that stillness inside. It contributes to the consciousness of thought that is bringing forward the best thinking in the world. And it chips away at whatever mental blocks would keep the division and the challenge going. So just one more point, and go ahead and type your questions. There's one question, but keep adding your questions in, and we'll have Q&A in just a moment, or your comments if you have any comments you want to add. I'll just end here with this idea from the Christian Science Monitor, of the Christian Science Monitor. It's a news source that you can find online, and the intention of it is to be like that canary, to offer a little nugget of goodness in the dialogue and the discourse that sets us on a path where we don't get pulled under the water by hopelessness, by despair, by discouragement, by frustration, or by incredulousness. That it takes us aside and gives us that little canary voice so that we can find those nuggets of goodness. Now, that's what I look for. When I read the Christian Science Monitor, I'm looking in each article for the idea that can spark my thought in a new direction that I didn't have before. And that's the goal of every article, is to try to find that little spark that adds something to the dialogue that's not there, that puts us on a path that injures nobody but blesses all of humanity. And I'll just end this portion with this idea from Mary Baker Eddy. She says that the best spiritual type of Christly method for uplifting human thought and imparting divine truth is stationary power, stillness, and strength. And when this spiritual ideal is made our own, it becomes the model for human action. That action stems from the stillness. That as we connect with that, we know what steps to take. All right, so there's a couple of questions here, and I just welcome you and invite you to chat in your own questions or your comments, and we'll just take maybe 5 or so minutes to just answer a couple of questions. And then I'll be happy to stay on for another 15 minutes or so and answer questions individually. If you'd rather have them asked individually, then I'll close in about 5 minutes, and then you can just ask questions individually, and I'll chat the answers back to you. So little of interaction here. Thank you all for joining us today. So one question is just how can we share the peace we feel with others? Well, someone said to me a while ago, and maybe you all have heard this, that people hear your words, but they feel your thoughts. And I don't know if you've experienced this. Maybe some of you have, where someone might be complimenting you on your dress or your shirt, but maybe in their thought they're thinking, oh, that's kind of an ugly shirt. And so you kind of feel that they don't really like it, even though they're saying they really like it. I mean, it's just, we kind of know that. You feel what people are thinking. And I think for me, that's how we can share peace too. That if we have found peace with ourselves, we don't have to do anything to get other people to feel it. That just finding it in ourselves tends to ripple out towards others. That we aren't disturbed, that we're living in the moment, that even if there are desires, questions, plans we want to make, things we'd like to move forward, and we don't feel like they're moving forward, we're not finding the solution, we'd love to just push it through, but it's not quite working, or others aren't quite along with us, that I find that just connecting with that peace in myself and really being just being there in the present moment with whatever is coming up for me, and keeping myself from walking down that road to 10 steps ahead of what should happen, but just really bringing it back to right this moment, to the now, to this exact moment, and connecting with that sense of peace. It doesn't always give me the assurance of that the thing I want to happen in 3 weeks from now or whatever, that it's going to happen the way I want it to. But what happens is that in that moment, the interactions suddenly are joyous or happier or more relaxed with colleagues or with people I'm working with or whatever, that peace is present. And it may not feel like enough. It may feel like, no, but we have to get this thing done, and we have to plan, and we have to blah, blah, blah. But But I think it's enough that people feel that peace and that we stop feeling like we're the ones shepherding everything, that we can respond to the way that God is shepherding it. And that to me is a real characteristic of peace, that we respond to the way that divine love is unfolding things. And we don't feel that willfulness that has to always make them happen. And maybe the outcome ends up differently than we expect. But I think being at peace with ourselves enables us to be open to a different outcome, and that we feel okay about it, even if it's not what we expected. So sharing the peace we feel with others, just holding it, I think it's enough. Having it present in our thoughts and letting it sort of radiate outwards, people will feel it. All right, any other questions that anyone would like to type? There's a technical question here. I'll just answer briefly. This web event has been recorded on YouTube, and the link will be emailed out to all of you tomorrow. And you can share that with anyone that you'd like to. You can forward the link or pass it on. It'll stay up for a short number of months, a few months, and then it will be taken down. But you can certainly share it for the next few months if you would like to, or review it, look it over again if you'd like to. All right, well, I'll give you another minute if you have any other questions. Otherwise, I will just close with a quote from Mary Baker Eddy that I'll read here. And as I'm closing, if you have more questions, go ahead and chat them. But Mary Baker Eddy talks about how mind, this divine consciousness of mind, revolves on a spiritual axis, and its power is displayed and its presence felt in eternal stillness and immovable love. So thank you all for joining us today, this afternoon, whatever time it is in your time zone. And I hope that you take a little bit of stillness with you into whatever you're going into next. Thanks for joining us. And again, I'll stay on the chat box for about 10 or 15 minutes if you have individual questions. Bye-bye.